Monty Noam Penkower. El profesor vive en Jerusalén, tiene 5 hijos y 20 nietos, todos viven en Jerusalén, y también tenemos la suerte de contar con su mujer que está en el fondo de la sala entre nosotros. So thank you for coming, first of all. Es un profesor emérito de Jewish History at the Mahon Lander Graduate Center of Jewish Studies en Jerusalén. El profesor Penkower ha sido consultor en el US Holocaust Memorial Council, el National Endowment for Humanities, el History Channel, la Destiny Foundation y el National Jewish Book Council. Ha recibido infinitas becas de investigación del National Foundation for Jewish Culture, del Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture, del Eleanor Roosevelt Institute, las bibliotecas presidenciales Hoover and Truman, la American Philosophical Society y la American Council of Learned Studies. Fue designado como historiador para la creación del primer memorial del Holocausto organizado por el Ayuntamiento de Nueva York. Un gran conocedor. Entre sus libros destacaremos Free World Diplomacy and the Holocaust, The Emergence of Zionist Thought, The Holocaust and Israel Reborn from Catastrophe to Sovereignty, y 20th Century Jews, y acaba de publicar su nuevo libro, que es La sombra de la esvástica, cada vez más oscura, Voces antes del Holocausto, que precisamente es el título de esta conferencia. Professor, thank you very much.
Shalom. Before I begin my lecture, I would like to thank 3 people who made it possible for me to be here. My first visit with my dear wife Yael to Barcelona, and we also went to Girona. First and foremost, Professor Xavier Torrens, for inviting me already a year ago. It didn't work out then. Now it did. A real pioneer in Holocaust education. Secondly, David Grebler of the Spinoza Foundation, a gracious host, a committed Jew, and a very fine human being. And third but not least, without whom you would not understand, most of you, what I'm saying, my dear translator, Dan Scher. And now to our topic. On the eve of Hitler's rise to power as Chancellor of the Third Reich, the Jews of Europe numbered about 9.5 million, or more than 60% of world Jewry. They had lived on the continent for more than 2,000 years, creating richly diverse, often dynamic cultures in the face of degradation, expulsion, and pogrom. Although constituting less than 2% of Europe's population, Jews emerged as political and intellectual luminaries in many countries. Most resided in Eastern Europe, with about 5.5 million living in Poland and the Soviet Union. Other substantial Jewish centers: Romania, Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Great Britain, France, Austria, the Netherlands, and Lithuania. In the However, this reality underwent a seismic shift. By VE Day on May 8, 1945, Germany's systematic annihilation of European Jewry during World War II, aided by collaborator nations and not countered by an Allied will to save, had taken a horrific toll. 2 out of every 3 of Europe's Jews, 90% and more in Eastern Europe, and 5,000 of their communities were obliterated forever. How had this come about? The convulsive spasm of murderous violence which overtook European Jewry, later called the Holocaust, has been impressively examined by historians over the past several decades. My own The Jews Were Expendable, The Holocaust in Israel Reborn, Decision on Palestine Deferred, explored some aspects of this story. Yet it is essential to commence with an examination of the years preceding the near annihilation of the Jews of Europe. What exactly was known at the time of how this community struggled to breathe as the anti-Semitic news tightened? And how did Jews and non-Jews respond? Much has been written about the steady corruption of daily life for the pre-war Jewish community in the Third Reich under Hitler, while individual studies have appeared about other countries. Yet an overview of the spread of Jew hatred across the European continent, rooted in numerous reports of that persecution, has eluded serious inspection till now. My newest book, The Swastika's Darkening Shadow, Voices Before the Holocaust, intends to do so while shining a lucid spotlight on the years between Hitler's advent as Chancellor of Germany, January 30th, 1933, and his unleashing of the Second World War on September 1, 1939. Also seeking to understand how Jews in peril navigated their world as darkness closed about. A generous selection of archival documents is also in this volume. Let's begin towards the end. In April 1939, with a poem published in the New Yorker magazine by W.H. Auden, the British poet, who movingly captured European Jewry's plight before World War II. 4 years earlier, Auden had consented to a marriage of convenience to Thomas Mann's eldest of 6 children, Erica, thereby giving her a British passport and an ability to escape Berlin. Having moved in January 1939 to the United States, where he would take American citizenship 7 years later, Auden's poem, Refugee Blues, against the consul banging the table and saying, if you've got no passport, you're officially dead. The committee asking him politely to return next year. A public speaker remarking, if we let them in, they will steal our daily bread. And referring to the Jews of Germany, the author observes, and I quote, "Thought I heard the thunder rumbling in the sky. It was Hitler over Europe saying, they must die," end quote. David Ben-Gurion copied down in his diary all the verses of this Refugee Blues after being shown a copy a month later in Yerushalayim. And he wrote in his diary, this poem by a non-Jew is worthy of being publicized in every Jewish home. 2 months later, the Berlin-born Gershon Sholem explained the reasons for his uncommunicative silence to his closest friend Walter Benjamin. Writing from Jerusalem at the end of June 1939, the depressed Hebrew University professor of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah revealed what he called the boundless gloom and paralysis that had come over him during the past several months because of the current state of affairs. Palestine had turned into a showplace of civil war. The labor movement had lost and it was deader than a doornail. And the British mandatories, authorities' capitulation to Arab violence all worried him. And then he ended on this note. The dreadful catastrophe that has befallen Judaism, a disaster whose dimensions no one can fully grasp, and the utter hopelessness of a situation in which hope is manufactured only in order to taunt us, all of this strikes one down and destroys one's peace of mind, end quote. At the very heart of this dreadful catastrophe, about which Sholem wrote, strode Adolf Hitler. Hitler's first expression on the so-called Jewish question, the Judenfrage, addressed to Adolf Gemlish on the 16th of September 1919, had declared, quote, the final aim must be the uncompromising removal of the Jews altogether, end quote. That pronouncement of what might be called eliminationist intent had only received scholarly appreciation in 1959 when a German historical quarterly quoted this. But readers of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, JTA, from 1923 onwards could entertain no doubt that anti-Semitism constituted the very core of Hitler's and none of his acolytes' political passion. The Nazi regime's firm conviction, driven by a pathological view of the Jew as the incarnation of evil, threatening German and world survival, was expressed and progressively implemented with shameless candor. Writing in his diary on the 5th of September 1944, Victor Klemperer, a Romance language professor in Dresden, who had converted to Protestantism and married a so-called Aryan woman, piano teacher, captured this reality in a telling metaphor, and I quote, "The Jewish problem is the poison gland of the swastika viper," end quote. Remarkably, but commonly overlooked, Poland and Romania were home to far more virulent assaults against Jews in the 1930s until Kristallnacht, while mounting legislation and brutal anti-Jewish attacks could readily be seen elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe. The drama unfolds well before Hitler finally decided in World War II upon a course of systematic slaughter for the one people whose crime, according to his dogmatic Weltanschauung, was that of birth, expiated only by death. The voices of Jews and Gentiles, of appeasers and opponents of Germany, of haters and champions of Jews, of Zionist Universalists, refugees, and natives on both sides of the Atlantic could all be heard. The baneful effect of anti-Semitism and its aggression, however crooked the path to Auschwitz-Birkenau, left many with an understandable sense of grim foreboding for European Jewry and its future. In a letter from Warsaw on the 25th of November 1938 to Martin Buber, who had departed Germany a few months earlier for a professorship at the Hebrew University, and anxious 31-year-old Abraham J. Heschel observed, quote, "Concepts are suddenly regaining their unambiguousness for everyone. Perhaps we can now bury relativism," end quote. None could have foretold the Shoah, the Hebrew term since adopted for the Holocaust, but the precariousness of Jewish existence on the soil of Europe could not be denied. Their options for survival decreased dramatically once Great Britain curtailed entry to the obvious haven of Palestine, joined by other nations who also closed their hearts and their doors to Jews in desperate need. Moreover, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and other leaders masked the Jewish people's unique calamity. With ever-thickening shadows of war clearly visible on the horizon, Realpolitik reigned supreme in these corridors of power. As a consequence, Europe's defenseless Jews, facing unprecedented anguish, would find few allies to answer the call of conscience. The storm clouds, let's begin, that burst over Europe with the start of World War II had begun to gather early on. 3 weeks after Hitler's obtaining a majority in the Reichstag with the Nationalist Bloc, former Princeton University professor Hibben presciently warned in the New York Times, and I quote, "Adolf Hitler is a menace to world peace, and if his policies bring war to Europe, the United States cannot escape participating," end quote. By the end of April 1933, Horace Rumbold, then British ambassador to Germany, and Hamilton Fish Armstrong, editor of Foreign Affairs, were among the first to realize that Hitler's uncompromising racism constituted the raison d'etre of his program for conquest, and that he would not be overthrown. His subsequent triumphs deepened the sense among the overwhelming mass of Germans of a reborn Volksgemeinschaft, binding each individual to the will and mission of der Führer. The everyday practice of exclusion destroyed the civil and constitutional order in Germany and transformed that nation into an aggressive and racist society. At the same time, various European statesmen, desperate to avoid another world war, and often more fearful of the spread of Soviet communism, as well as buoyed by American supporters like Joseph Kennedy, then U.S. ambassador to Great Britain, clung to the mantra that a concession here and there could check Nazi aspirations and keep world peace. The same reasoning lay behind the wish of France and a number of other delegations to the League of Nations not to alienate Germany, and the decision to accede when Hitler sent troops to reoccupy the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, staged the Olympiad in Berlin, annexed Austria, and demanded the Sudetenland. All chose to overlook the patent fact that for Julius Streicher, Heinrich Himmler, Alfred Rosenberg, Walter Frick, Hermann Göring, Hitler himself, Joseph Goebbels, Hess, Heydrich Eichmann, that the twin doctrines of Lebensraum, living space, for a pure Aryan race engaged in a struggle against its more mortal enemy, the Jew, and of warfare to attain this end, so frankly declared in Mein Kampf, were directly linked to concrete action. The influential Lord Lothian offers a classic example of those who demonstrated their inability to comprehend Hitler's mind. A wartime assistant to Lloyd George, who had later aided the former prime minister considerably in drafting the Treaty of Versailles, Lothian pronounced in the London Times in early 1935, after an interview with the Führer, that Germany sought not war but real equality. His words. Most importantly, I quote Lothian again, Hitler told him he will pledge Germany not to interfere in his beloved Austria by force. Not having the slightest doubt, again his words, that Hitler was sincere, Lothian believed the cruelty and merciless oppression of weak minorities characteristic of the Nazi regime would due in large measure to the fact that Germany had not enjoyed their rights at any time in the last 16 years. He urged his fellow countrymen to treat Germany as a loyal friend. He publicly asserted Germany is not imperialist in the old sense of the word. Yet Hitler's war against the Jewish people, comprising the key to his Manichaean ideology, had also commenced in the years before World War II. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency in particular carried stories almost on a daily basis of anti-Semitic violence in the Third Reich and in subsequent areas of Nazi domination. Persecution in which scholars Cada and Kaplan later confirmed Germans acquiesced and often spontaneously took an active role. The JTA's coverage should have left no doubt as to Hitler's dogmatic views, as well as his ruthless determination to defend humanity against the menace of what he termed international Bolshevik Jews. The constant Nazi demonization of Jews as vermin, bacilli, and parasites. The evolving repression and omnipresent threat that made life for condemned Jews increasingly unsupportable. The activity of zealous officials like Eichmann or Heydrich. None were hidden from public view. They were absolute prerequisites for the so-called final solution of the Jewish question. Deren Lösung zur Judenfrage, later Nazi code for getting rid of all Jews by methodical murder. A growing awareness of European Jewry's ever-worsening plight did not spark a generous response on the part of governments to receive Jews in desperate need. As Jews were not a major issue or of no interest to statesmen who grappled with unemployment, rearmament, and popular anti-Semitism, according to Zara Steiner, and I quote her, pressures for collective action gave way to policies of self-defense, neutrality, and isolation. The specter that encouraging German Jewish migration might well provoke the flight of countless other Jews out of Germany. Experts spoke of nearly 5 million Jews seeking exit, excluding Russia, to the east of Germany, reinforced this attitude. The horrific nature of Kristallnacht on the nights of November 8th and 9th and 10th, 1938, across the Third Reich, and the subsequent coordination in Nazi policy under Goering and the SS leadership, continued to encounter but minor opposition in Germany. That state-sanctioned pogrom, marking the culmination of a policy which had proceeded in less than a decade from defining Jews as a stigmatized pariah race, to social quarantine, to disenfranchisement and economic strangulation, to their ultimate physical removal from German Lebensraum, wiped away remaining illusions for most. Nonetheless, on December 16, 1938, the very day that Le Temps publicized Premier Edouard Daladier's cabinet's willingness in France to allow the absorption of a contingent of Jewish refugee children, Minister of the Interior Saurat sent urgent telegrams to prefects in the northern eastern border provinces telling them, bar the entry of German Jewish children in particular. His Majesty's government closed off wide entry to the most obvious haven of Palestine in May 39 with the White Paper, and other countries sealed their borders. The search for alternative havens beyond Europe, notably championed by Roosevelt, proved a delusion. Too little and too late. Anti-Jewish aggression elsewhere on the continent also received extensive coverage in the JTA, Jewish organizational reports, diplomatic correspondence, and other venues. The rapid spread of violent Jew hatred and the rise to power of the radical right in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Danzig, Lithuania, and Latvia, reflecting the confluence of economic distress, Christian indoctrination, the triumph of chauvinism, xenophobia, anti-Bolshevism, and the great prestige of Nazi Germany. This could not be denied, nor could Nazi influence in Arab countries. The pages of my book record there how this tragedy mounted and spread over the course of 6 years. The Holocaust, in sum, did not occur in a vacuum. If we take a brief look at some countries outside of Germany during the very first month of 1933 is self-revealing. The Bishop of Linz, that's Hitler's hometown, Johannes Follner, while rejecting the Nazis' radical anti-Semitism and anti-Christian program, condemned in a pastoral letter, quote, the destructive Jewish spirit for carrying capitalism, socialism, and Bolshevism. Romania witnessed mass meetings of the virulently anti-Jewish Iron Guardists, also known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael or the Green Shirts, in Chernovitz, Kishinev, Klausenburg, with the local archbishop leading their demolishment of the home of a Jew near the church in Bucharest. Kuzis party members, followers of Professor Kuza, head of the League of National Christian Defense, assaulted Jewish students in Chernovitz University, attacked 2 Jewish newspapers. No one involved in the virulent pogrom in Yassi was punished, while the murder of 5 Jews in Soroka, or Romania, was passed over without a trial of the guilty. For the second time, this is all the first month of 33, within 2 days, Jews were murdered in East Galicia. Warsaw University authorities refused to enroll Jewish medical students for anatomic studies. Anti-Jewish boycott insiders in Posen, Pomerania districts distributed flyers with the inscription, "Only swine buy from Jews." In the Sejm, the parliament, national democratic deputies called for the expulsion of Jews because they robbed the Poles of their bread and objected to the placing of military orders with Jewish firms. In 1934, developments in Poland, where Jews constituted a tenth of the total population, the highest percentage of Jews in any land but Palestine, and formed over a quarter of the urban population, gave great rise for anxiety. Of the country's Jews, who were primarily concentrated in commerce and handicrafts, almost half were bordering on economic ruin, according to a report that August from the JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. In September, Foreign Minister Joseph Beck renounced the Minorities Treaty, which had protected Jews and other minorities since World War I. As of 1919, the British and French representatives immediately registered strong protest, but that carried very little weight against nationalist feeling in Poland and elsewhere, much coming from Germany, the propaganda. And further reflecting the prevailing consensus, Alexander Cardinal Kakowski responded to an appeal from 4 rabbis by accusing Jews of propagating atheism, supporting communism, publishing pornography, and implied that Jewish behavior provoked Polish youth to use regrettable Nazi methods. Nor were conditions promising elsewhere on the continent. The day after, Austrian Chancellor Schausning declared, yes, Austria treated its Jewish citizens as equals, his government issued a decree segregating Jews from Catholics in the country's public schools. A new wave of anti-Semitism broke out in Romania, where hundreds of Jews, thousands in fact, faced abject poverty. In Latvia, a right-wing dictatorship. The head of the High Semites, an emigration Jewish society, reported that a new wave from Germany of stateless Jews of Polish and Russian origin were in a state of terrible misery, and they were arriving in Czechoslovakia. What do? Funds are running out. Anti-Semitism rises. Early 1935, persecution of Jews continued in and beyond the Third Reich's borders. All health officers in Germany were instructed to propagate racial purity in close contact with the Nazi organization, while all wives of dentists and doctors had to submit proof of their Aryanism. In Austria, Nazi newspapers, where many Jews in Austria committed suicide because of rampant discrimination in the professions, demanded a complete boycott of Jewish lawyers. The majority of the Danzig Senate, consisting of Nazi members, officially applied for the dissolution of the parliament and for new elections, which might easily bring the status of the so-called free city into question, and Jews were terrorized for obvious reasons. In Upper Silesia, hundreds of Jews who had lived for years in their various trades, peddling, etc., were threatened by a law against that trade. In Romania, where anti-Jewish propaganda on a large scale was being financed by Germany, insisted all economic and civil enterprises had to employ 80% Romanian personnel. Nor did the situation improve throughout 1935. A wave of terror and suicides occurred among Jews throughout Germany. Mass arrests, the closing of Jewish firms, the stoning of Jewish houses by SA members were reported in the JTA. The Nuremberg laws of September 35, separating Jews from the rest of the population by depriving them of political equality, prohibiting marriages or sexual relations between Jews and Germans, as well as the employment of German maids under the age of 45 in Jewish households. Jews could no longer raise a swastika banner. Said the London Times headline, Jews are coming to be denied the right to live. On the last day of 1935, when submitting his resignation as the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, James MacDonald, an American, noted, and I quote, "The doors of most countries are closed against impoverished fugitives." And he called on members of the League and other nations to resort to friendly but firm intercession with Berlin for a modification of policies, which are a challenge to the conscience of mankind and a menace to the legitimate interests of the states affected by the immigration of German refugees. Some praise in some quarters followed his public letter, but no positive government response followed. While anti-Semitic legislation increasingly told in Germany throughout January 1936, a worrisome picture appeared elsewhere that same month. In Czechoslovakia and German districts, anti-Jewish boycott became greatly intense. Karlsbad's Jews also received regularly a replica of a railway ticket with the inscription, "Free passage to Palestine, but no return journey." A gang attacked the only Jewish family in the village of Wola in Poland, killing the mother, seriously injuring her 4 children. 2 bombs exploded outside of Krakow's Jewish areas. 3 Jewish shops were set on fire, etc. Anti-Jewish demonstrations were held in the universities of Grodno, Lvov, and Warsaw. The Association of Catholic German Youth in Vienna called for a boycott of Jewish enterprises. In Lithuania, 33 Jews were injured in 2 townships. Chief Rabbi Jacob Niedermauer of Romania narrowly missed death at the hands of 3 young assassins, members of the fascist Iron Guard. Some 50,000 Jews in Romania's Bessarabia province, suffering from the 3rd famine in the last 12 years, were in a worse position than their Gentile neighbors because of anti-Semitic boycotts and lack of government relief. On February 13th, in France, a Socialist Party leader, Léon Blum, a Jew, was dragged from a car in Paris and beaten almost to death by the Camelots du Roi, young group of anti-Semitic Action Française royalists. A Vienna court ruled that the German law prohibiting intermarriage between Aryans, in quotes, and Jews was applicable to Jewish subjects of the Reich living in Austria. The Vienna Archbishopric added we refuse to register offices. It would not have any Jews registered as Catholics in Vienna. They could not wed Germans either. As they went on to trial in Katowice, Poland, 21 adherents of the semi-fascist Endek party admitted to having bombed synagogues in several Polish towns. While admonishing Poles not to assault Jews, Cardinal Holland's pastoral letter read as follows on February 29th. Jews were free thinkers who constitute the vanguard of atheism, of the Bolshevik movement, and of revolutionary activity. He supported a boycott of Jewish institutions on the part of the Catholic Church. And Prince Radziwill, president of the National Conservative Bloc, appealed in the parliament for the mass, immediate, forcible emigration of Jews. On March 9th, 1936, a savage pogrom in Prychik against 700 Jewish families claimed 3 Jewish lives, the destruction of shops and the burning of houses, reflecting mounting anti-Semitic terror in Poland. The Endek and extreme rightist Nara party, National Radical, had stirred the peasant masses to violent attacks all across Poland. Scores of Jews were murdered. Hundreds were wounded. Separate ghetto benches for Jewish students, first instituted the previous December in Lvov Polytechnicum, were instituted in Polish universities. Heavy taxes threatened kosher slaughter. Premeditated riots after the Prychik pogrom followed in Nowovelchia, Swidlik, Częstochowa, Lodz, and elsewhere. In the Third Reich, the comparative quiet which Jews had enjoyed from Nazi propaganda activities as a result of the Summer Olympics proved to be short-lived. Across the border to the east, Poland's Jews witnessed attacks of a more murderous nature. In September, More than 50 Jews were wounded in violent disorders in the town of Vysotsky Mazowiecki. 2 months later, 2 Jews were seriously wounded by a peasant mob in the Bialystok region. Endek agitators also instigating a bitter anti-Jewish boycott in Cheshuv. On November 27th, Jewish stay-in strike spread to Poznan and so forth. Donning gas masks, police stormed Warsaw University to eject several hundred nationalists. A 4-day strike in Vilna, then Vilna in Poland, over ghetto benches, during which more than 30 Jews were wounded, including one who lost an eye, remained unresolved. In Romania, some 250,000 members of the National Christian Party, led by the poet Octavian Goga, and largest of the country's many anti-Semitic organizations, assembled in Bucharest on November 6th. 250,000. They paraded with large swastika banners throughout the city, shouting anti-Semitic slogans. Go declared, the Jewish leprosy has spread like eczema over the whole country. Returning home, they set on fire various Jewish places. The Green Shirts, for about a half an hour, the leader of the Green Shirts reported in the London Times, spoke for a half an hour about the need, I'm quoting, exterminating the 1 million Jews who were citizens of Romania. In Danzig, Nazi leaders eliminated opposition parties. Goebbels der Angriff published an editorial imputing to the Jews the causes of Polish hostility towards the Nazis in this regard. Nor did assaults abate in 1937. In Eastern Europe, declared Tolhali Schuss, he was the major New York Times reporter in Eastern Europe, he reported in early February in the Times, the spread of anti-Semitism was turning the Jewish tragedy there into, quote, a final disaster of truly historic magnitude. The calamity in Latvia, Lithuania, Hungary, and Romania, I'm continuing, approaching its high water mark in Poland, said Tolhali, confronted those Jewish communities with a choice of repeating the Exodus on a bigger scale than that chronicled in the Bible, or dying a slow death from economic strangulation. Tolhali cited an unofficial toll that between May 1935, when Pilsudski, the marshal, died, and the end of January 37, 118 Jews had been killed and 1,350 wounded. 35 Jewish homes were burned down, etc., etc. Detailed JTA reports corroborated his warning. In resolving that no more Jewish lawyers were to be admitted to the Romanian Law Association, some speakers at that group's General Assembly on February 8th asserted the Jews are parasites that must be gotten rid of. Permits were granted a week later to 3 new anti-Semitic dailies. In Bialystok, Jews, as reported, were in a state worse than World War, the previous war, said Jewish deputy Emil Sommersheim. Few persons implicated were brought to trial. Ghetto benches continued. Physical violence, in addition to other anti-Jewish action, prevailed in other European countries. Kuzitz in Bucharest seriously wounded 30 Jews, including several women, and Patriarch Miron Christia, leader of the Romanian Orthodox Church, praised Cuza, I quote, as an enthusiastic nationalist figure. His remarks seconded by the Orthodox patriarchs of Bessarabia, Transylvania, and Bukovina. In the Hungarian town of Debrecen, rioters broke the windows of 3 synagogues and homes. Budding anti-Semitic parties, such as the Arrow Cross, so reported the British ambassador to London, he writing from Budapest, were being carefully wet-nursed from Germany. In Vilna, 54 Jewish students were excluded from the National Sciences faculty. That summer proved grim for Jews in Eastern and Central Europe. 6 Jews were injured in Ostrów Mazowiecki in Poland. On August 24, 50 Jews were beaten, 7 of them seriously, in a market day raid by Index in the town of Bransk. The same occurred in other places. Scores of Jews fled to Warsaw as disorders spread throughout Białystok province. On September 13, 1937, not long after Hitler had denounced the Bolshevik substitution of a race of Jewish parasites in place of real intellectual nationals, and 2 days after Goebbels pointed the finger that the Jew was the visible demon of the decay of humanity, the Führer publicly hammered home his consistent thesis about world Jewry being the force behind Bolshevism and the historic enemy of humanity. All this well before the Holocaust. Greater physical outbreaks in Poland heralded the arrival of the Jewish New Year. Jews were killed, many injured in Poznan, Tohu, Lomża, Drobush, Malkinia, all in Poland. 20 Jews were wounded and more than 100 beaten in Warsaw, Lodz, Lomża, 10 other localities. 11 Jews were wounded in the market day riots in Sokolov. The Nara party organ boasted of further attacks in other places in Poland. Members of the youth section of Colonel Koch's Camp of National Unity called for mass Jewish emigration, and placards in Piotrków declared, "Death to the Jews." These were not removed despite the intervention of the socialist mayor. More than 50 Jews were injured, at least 8 seriously in Częstochowa and other places on September 21. Violence surged forth in Romania as well. A number of Jews were seriously beaten with clubs in Buhusi, a town in Moldavia, before police restored order. Archdeacon Jon Mota of Orostic suggested on September 9th that Jews should be, quote, isolated and burned out, end quote, like weeds, and compared the Jews to an attack of scabies, for which he suggested a disinfecting treatment. He added the next best thing was to follow the plan of the great master Hitler in dealing with Jews. And Bishop Tit of Hotin, in an article entitled The Jewish Plague, urged an anti-Jewish boycott under the slogan, "Not a pin from a Jew." The influential church dignitary pressed for the expulsion of Jews from Romania. Several Ukrainian leaders in Cernauti appealed for permission to publish the Elders of Zion, the anti-Semitic screed, intending to use Streicher's version, and they would print 10,000 copies to spread throughout Romania. What option for emigration, therefore, existed for Jews desperately seeking haven? Approximately 125,000 persons had fled from Germany since 1933, of whom approximately 13,000 to 15,000 were non-Jews. And now the pressure was far greater. Director Mark Wiesnitzer of the Hilfsverein in Berlin noted that immigration into the United States and South America was limited, while good opportunities in South Africa, Rhodesia, Australia, Kenya required considerable preliminary work before large-scale efforts could be made. Beck in Poland and others urged that Palestine be open to Jewish immigration. But Britain's expert in the Foreign Office, George Rendell, replied to Michalowski, the Polish First Secretary in London, Palestine, quote, could offer no solution to the major demographic problems, I quote, of Europe. And he privately added to colleagues in the secret minutes, it is by no means inconceivable that if there was some turn of the wheel in Europe, a no longer actively Jew-baiting Germany might find a ready-made spiritual colony awaiting her in a key position in the Middle East. Our policy, he concluded, of creating a Jewish state in Palestine for the sake of Jewish immigrants from Poland and Central Europe has provoked the uncompromising hostility of practically the whole Arab world. Developments in November 37 were even bleaker. Attacks continued in Danzig. A new Italian edition of the protocols appeared in Rome. Some Polish universities were closed after riots there. Streicher had an exhibit called The Eternal Jew, made waves all around Germany. It's an exhibit informing people of the blood libel of murdering Christian boys to use their blood for the matzah of Passover. And prisoners, reported the London Daily Herald, are still tortured to death in German concentration camps. That's reported in the newspaper. The Nazi Party asserted publicly on November 16th, Jews should show gratitude that lynch law was not used to solve the Jewish problem, even as we're trying to carry out the complete segregation of Jewry. In Budapest, 500 Jews were rounded about. 30 were detained for deportation. They couldn't produce proper ID papers. Assaults occurred in Lithuania. The arrest of a Swiss citizen in Bern disclosed Nazi espionage efforts there. But Romania then presented the greatest danger. On December 29th, King Carol invited Goga to form a new cabinet within 24 hours. As the months of 1938 went by, European Jewry rapidly approached the abyss of despair. In Vilna, the Association of Journalists adopted the Aryan paragraph. 20 Jews were beaten by demonstrators, saying, "What happened in Romania will happen here." The pro-German Arrow Cross attacked Jewish skiers in Budapest. The spread of Nazi racial theories and literature in Italy drew the denunciation of the semi-official Vatican organ, but an authoritative Italian spokesman gave his blessing to, quote, "the great historical experiment started in Romania," and La Stampa declared Jewish domination of democratic countries followed the methods outlined in the protocols. The Latvian government began taking over Jewish enterprises in the, quote, interests of the state. The Bern Cantonal Court overruled the conviction of 2 Nazis for distributing copies of the protocols, claiming that while these writings are, quote, particularly vile, they were not to be considered, quote, immoral literature in the strict sense of the Bern Penal Code. 52 Jews were wounded in Poland, March 20th, Lithuanian capital of Kaunas. Jews were beaten almost to death. By a vote of 210 to 42, Great Britain's House of Commons turned down a bill giving the Home Office much wider powers for the admission of Austrian Jewish refugees. In the United States, Secretary of State Cordell Hull announced no increase in the German and Austrian quotas could be contemplated. The Evian Conference on Refugees, convened between July 6th and 15th, 1938, to respond to European Jewry's growing crisis, witnessed delegate after delegate limiting official responses to sympathizing with refugees and to deploring Nazi brutality. But Australia's Thomas White exhibited no embarrassment in asserting boldly, I quote, "As we have no racial problem, we are not desirous of importing Jews." France had reached, quote, and this is their delegate talking, "the extreme point of saturation as regarding admission of refugees," and many European countries there followed. Switzerland's delegate insisted it is essential to exercise very stringent control over the admission of any further foreigners. After the U.S. delegate Myron Taylor took the lead about his countries maintaining strict admission quotas, the South American governments declared that their restrictive quotas could also not be changed. The British Dominion sounded the same tone. The one exception at Evian proved to be the Dominican Republic, which offered to accept up to 100,000 Jewish and other refugees on generous terms. What did they do at Evian? They unanimously created the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees. charged with approaching the governments of the countries of refuge with a view to developing opportunities for permanent settlement and seeking to persuade Germany to cooperate in establishing conditions of orderly emigration. At the end of the conference, which clearly did nothing, Golda Meir, then Goldie Meyerson, representing Palestine's Histadrut labor organization, called a conference and said, "There is only one thing I hope to see before I die, and that is that my people should not need expressions of sympathy anymore." In the meantime, the lower house of the Hungarian parliament set quotas limiting Jews to 20% of the positions in certain businesses. In early June, seizure of Jews in Vienna had mounted into the thousands. Over 1,000 were sent to the Dachau concentration camp. Jews were wounded and killed in Poland, over 200. On July 14th, Benito Mussolini's fascist government announced Jews did not belong to the Aryan Italian race. In the Third Reich, Kristallnacht, of which we now know so much, the Night of Broken Glass, shocked Jewry and augmented its despair. An official Nazi report stated that 91 Jews had been killed, hundreds wounded. The Board of Deputies of British Jews reported 500 destroyed synagogues. Hundreds of Jewish shops and dwellings were looted and destroyed. More than 30,000 Jews were sent to concentration camps, where several hundred would die in the following weeks. The Jewish community was fined $400 million, 1 billion Reichsmarks, with an accelerated Aryanization of all remaining Jewish property sold to non-Jews for 10% of its value. As Karl Schlunis's pioneering analysis has shown, the experts would now be in charge of the Third Reich's Jewish policy. Goering and the SS leadership, Heydrich, Eichmann, would provide professional coordination at last, from which alone could emerge, I'm quoting Schlunis, a single direction and a clearly defined objective, end quote, how to get rid of the Jews. As 1938 drew to a close, serious attacks against Jews occurred in Bessarabia. The Index won a substantial majority in the Poznan municipal elections. Netherlands branches of German firms dismissed Jews. The Finance Ministry of Romania, where Kristallnacht had given strong fillip to anti-Semitism, ordered 400 Jewish-owned inns and 800 tobacco shops to close on sanitary grounds. More than 800 Jewish families, fearing a Nazi victory in Memel, evacuated that area of Lithuania. And so we come to the last year of 1939. On the 30th of January, Hitler announced the following publicly during an address in the Reichstag, the German parliament, and I quote, "If the international Jewish financiers in and outside Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth, and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." End quote. The annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Forcing the pace against Jewry could be found elsewhere in Europe as well. In 1939, 9 Jews were injured when a bomb was thrown on February 5th into Hungary's major synagogue. In Hungary, Premier Imredi had to resign because it was found that one of his family, a Jewish great-grandmother, was Jewish. His successor, Talecki, oversaw passage of the second Jewish law, initiated by Imredi to steal the thunder of the Arrow Cross, which further restricted the economic participation of the Jews on racial grounds. Hungarian authorities began to drive to deport all foreign Jews from Czech territories that they had received by Hitler's order. In Munkac alone, 300 Polish Jewish families were given a week's notice to leave. Another 200 families of Yugoslav and Romanian Jews were ordered to depart within 2 weeks. After the Wehrmacht took over the remaining parts of Czechoslovakia, the Rump, Bohemia, and Moravia on March 1939, this is a year after Hitler annexes Austria, to the wild support of the Austrian people, and Hitler now is creating in Czechoslovakia a protectorate, which really means Nazi control. It destroyed the democratic Czech state. Suicides of Jews and mass arrests by the Gestapo began. Jewish merchants sold their businesses to Aryans as quickly as possible. Looting began immediately. The largest synagogue in Brünn was destroyed by a fire. So was the one in Olomouc by Nazi instigators. Office was set upon in Prague, supervised by Eichmann, to have a centralized bureau for Jewish emigration. And that would be the case in every country thereafter that the Germans moved into and conquered. Eichmann would be in charge of the Central Office of Jewish Immigration. We know eventually where that emigration sent the Jews. In May 1939, as I said, the British White Paper was issued, severely limiting entry to Palestine of Jews. A total of 75,000 in the next 5 years. Thereafter, let me emphasize the language, with Arab consent. No Arab freely would consent to any Jew coming in then to Palestine. The U.S. took a similar position in barring entry of Jews. When Roosevelt responded to Kristallnacht, what did he do? He recalled the U.S. ambassador, and he combined the German and Austrian quotas. That's it. The Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, barred from Miami's waters over 900 Jews on the St. Louis, which first had sailed to Cuba, was denied entry at the last minute, sailed around South America, again denied entry, went up to Miami area, denied entry, went back to Europe. They had no choice. Fortunately, the JDC got the monies in time to get them entry into areas, countries surrounding Germany. In Hungary, as the war neared, public opinion had shifted so far to the right that the Arrow Cross Party garnered the second largest number of votes in the national election. In Austria, wrote the Journal of the American Medical Association, Aryanization of the medical profession is now complete. 2 days later, any Jew living in Bohemia, Moravia Protectorate was officially defined according to the 1935 German Nuremberg laws. Come August of 1939, the U.S. Embassy in London passed on to the State Department a report from the JDC that Eichmann had ordered Jews in the Protectorate to be prepared for immigration at a rate of up to 300 per day. The first concentration camp in Danzig territory was opened at August 3rd at Gürtland, with more than 60 Jews unable to work under the city's anti-Semitic laws. Quote, in the interest of cooperation with the German nation, end quote, a branch of President Hacha's party ordered that as of August 15th, 39, no Czech female citizen under the age of 45 could be employed by Jews, and all Jews had to be dismissed from Czech associations and commercial enterprises. The Belgian government ordered all municipalities to draw up immediately lists of all foreigners residing there. In Bratislava, 3 synagogues were sacked. There was a pogrom between August 11th and 13th, which injured many Jews. What about Shanghai as a refuge? After at least 18,000 penniless Jewish refugees from Central Europe reached there, a rare haven that required no entry visa, the Japanese naval authorities announced no further refugees could reside in the Hankyu district where the Jews resided. And with the breaking of dawn on the 1st of September 39, Hitler unleashed the Nazi blitzkrieg against Poland, bringing all the nations of the continent to the brink. A war motivated by Hitler's obsession with racial purity, which would engulf the globe. The clock had run out on imperiled, isolated European Jewry. What lessons might be drawn? Some individuals had come forward to answer the call of conscience. James MacDonald, Lord Robert Cecil, Pope Pius XI, Cardinals Verviers in France, Mundolin in the United States, the French author Romain Rolland, the Archbishop of Canterbury, British MPs Winston Churchill, Hosea Wedgwood, Leopold Emery, and others denounced these vicious assaults, viewing them, as American columnist Dorothy Thompson said, a human crisis. Not a Jewish crisis, a human crisis. The eminent Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr pleaded eloquently before the National Convention of Hadassah's Women's Zionist Group in October 1938 that Christians, I quote him, owe the Jews a haven of a national home in Palestine at the precise moment when it is most desperately needed to offer asylum and the chance of rehabilitation of thousands of refugees from Europe. And that Britain, this is still Niebuhr, could not afford to make additional concessions to dictators without imperiling her moral prestige, just as she cannot afford to break her word otherwise. Noted American publicist Raymond Swing, having just returned from Europe, warned the same gathering, the Jews have no place but Palestine. Quote, they face extinction after the most brutal torture and exploitation. The tide is against them. It is against all minorities. Yet, such expressions of concern and appeals for action, fleeting flashes in the darkness, exercised little effect on national leaders, who chose the role of bystanders in a world governed by what Ben-Gurion characterized as power politics, rather than respond to the call of conscience. The Chamberlain cabinet's policy of appeasing Hitler, for example, also determined its policy to Palestine. The first seeks to avoid a war. The second, to prepare for one. You appease the Arabs because the Jews will certainly not go in favor of Hitler, but the Arabs might, as indeed many did during World War II. For Roosevelt, the Great Depression, nativist sentiment, and rising anti-Semitism in the U.S. weighed heavily in the balance. In addition, the communal identity of world Jewry was regularly masked by these powers behind the term refugees, such as in the title of the Evian Conference, or denied outright. This even occurred in a letter made public against the Third Reich in early 1936 by Thomas Mann. The word Jew is not in that letter at all. Even Pius XI, very courageous, mit brennender Sorge, with searing anxiety, branding the Nazi ideology of racism and totalitarianism, quote, aggressive paganism, 1 year later, made no mention of Jews. In opaque observation, the draconian 1939 British White Paper made but one reference to Jewry's beleaguered lot, and it said, His Majesty's government was, quote, conscious of the unhappy plight of large numbers of Jews who seek refuge from certain European countries, period, end quote. Even when oversimplifying, by not admitting that the Nazis allowed Jews to emigrate only with practically no money, Goebbels der Angriff, as reported in the New York Times soon after Kristallnacht, told the truth this time, and I quote Goebbels, clearly, the possibility for Jews to emigrate has been greatly diminished. That is not the fault of Germany, but wholly of the countries that on the one hand intervene with resounding speeches for the pitiable Jewish people, and on the other hand, as the Evian Conference so clearly proved, do not think at all to take in Jews themselves. A political cartoon by Sidney George Strube, first appearing in London's Daily Express in June 38, with a single caption, "Whither?" Where to? Poignantly captured the escalating crisis. He was the highest paid journalist on Fleet Street, and this is the cartoon. You see an elderly, clearly Jew, non-Aryan, slumped in the center of the cartoon. There's a large swastika going to four corners of the page. He's slumped over in sleep. The bearded Jew leans against a signpost with the word "go," pointing to all four directions. But the four ends of the globe, reached by the extending swastika, are each marked with one word: stop. To the right of the frame, there's a sunrise heralding the Evian Conference. The Sunday edition of the New York Times copied this cartoon a little later, but with a different caption. Will the Evian Conference guide him to freedom? The answer was not long in coming. And if there's one thesis to my book, there are many, but the primary one, culpability lay at many a door. Jews understood early on, as Jewish Agency political director Shertak put it to Walkup in 1934, the High Commissioner, they were running a race against time. Already in April 33, Stephen Wise, the eminent Zionist leader, said, FDR is doing nothing. He's not quite alive to the fact this may be the beginning of a worldwide movement against Jewry. Wise on Roosevelt. The later eminent Polish-Jewish writer, Isaac Bashevis Singer, wrote a novel in 1935, Satan in Gore. He migrated to the U.S. It was written really in 1933. And he had Jews in this novel foreseeing the gathering of Catholic Polish peasants to, quote, his word, exterminate the Jews. In the summer of 1936, another eminent Polish poet, Tuwim, in The Ball at the Opera, predicted an apocalypse of Poles against Jews. Wrote Albert Einstein, the same year, to the economist Otto Nathan. He had fled Berlin, never returned, stayed in Princeton. The developments in Europe are unspeakably horrible. The Lord God appears to have appointed the devil to be the chief clerk of it. Leo Lauterbach, who was of the World Zionization after visiting Austria in April 1938, said, the German policy in Austria may aim at a complete annihilation of Austrian Jewry. Austrian-born composer Arnold Schoenberg, who also fled Germany, found refuge in Los Angeles, wrote an essay and posed this question: is there room in the world for almost 7 million people? Are they condemned to doom? Will they become extinct, famished, butchered? 4 months later, Sejm delegate Sommerschein denounced in the same, quote, the extermination policy of the present government and system. But, and this is an important but, no one could hardly forecast the depth of human depravity that would befall the Jews of Europe in the global conflict to come. While words like annihilation, extermination, Shoah, the onrush of lava, that's the graphic phrase of the revisionist Zionist leader Vladimir Jabotinsky, these surfaced with greater frequency in the 1930s. But no one could have foreseen the Holocaust, when Jewish hopes would literally be reduced to ashes. That unprecedented catastrophe was simply inconceivable. Before 1938, notes Avram Barkai, even the most pessimistic Zionists who foresaw a complete end to German Jewry planned for an orderly emigration of 15 to 20 years with no more than 20 to 25,000 immigrants annually. Jewish agency official Arthur Rupin spoke at the Evian conference of about 50,000 Jews per year from Germany and Austria over 6 years. Jabotinsky, October 38, presses for the immigration of 1 million Jews within 3 years. But in May 39, he didn't think any war would come. Nazi Germany, he said, is an inflated balloon. Even when Ben-Gurion, after Kristallnacht, called for what he said was an Aliyah rebellion, because he sees Kristallnacht, I'm quoting him, as the signal for the extermination of the Jewish people throughout the world, referred to the entry of 1 million Jews in a short time. There were people who were closer in Europe who saw more of what was going on. Joachim Prinz, a noted Reform rabbi later in the American Civil Rights Movement, charismatic Reform rabbi. In 1934, V. Juden, his book, welcomed initially Hitler because it would force the assimilated Jews of Germany to show their colors and would alarm the strictly Orthodox who would oppose Zionism for religious reasons. But when he came to the United States, he didn't go any further than saying the following: the attempt of the German government is, after the attempt of Spain in 1492, the first attempt to expel a jury and to insult a jury, instead of solving a problem which really is a problem in the world. Even the most eminent Jewish historian of the day, Shimon Dubnov, misjudged the singular nature of Hitler's paranoid judeophobia. Having left Berlin for Riga when Hitler came to power, the 79-year-old advocate of granting spiritual and cultural autonomy to the Jewish population of Europe wrote in June 1939 that the Jews had to set up and support an international league for protection of the Jewish people against aggression. Hitler, he's trying to do what Haman did or tried to do against the Jews, etc. And yet 1 month later, just before the war broke out, in an interview with a correspondent from Davar, the labor Yishuv newspaper, he saw no fundamental difference between totalitarian rule and previous absolutist regimes, and maintained his faith in autonomous Jewish life in the diaspora. Probably Mordechai Gebertig, the eminent Polish Jewish poet in Yiddish, probably claimed closest to articulating the enormity of the danger. He was born in 1877. He had become increasingly popular because of love songs, children's songs. He writes a poem, Sebrennt, fire. He called out there, after the Pritchett pogrom, for his readers to realize, I'm quoting him, "Our poor town's on fire." And these lines struck with particular force. "The dreaded moment may soon come when the town, with us included, will be turned to flames and ashes. Brothers," he said, "take out the pails, get rid of the fire." Yet everyone sensed, without the limitation, the screw press of history inexorably tightening about Europe's Jews. Bernard Wasserstein's recent book has shown ably that they were actors in their own destiny, but they remained fundamentally powerless. Such was the hallmark of Jewish exile. Accepting the 1938 Nobel Peace Prize that December 38, as president of the Nansen International Office, Michael Hansen warned, quote, "The Jewish problem in Europe now included some 5 million people who were increasingly outlawed in many countries because governments become more unfeeling and the people more fearful and suspicious." Hearing British Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald commenting on May 13, 1939, after the White Paper, that the Jews had made many mistakes, Chaim Weizmann, head of the World Zionist Organization, sharply retorted in bitterness, "Our chief mistake is that we exist at all." The World Zionist Organization's public cri de coeur actually was said earlier in November 36 at the Appeal Commission, which was deciding what to do with Palestine. And publicly he said, there are 6 million Jews, 6 million Jews living east of the Rhine, quote, doomed to be pent up in places where they are not wanted and for whom the world is divided into places where they cannot live and places in which they cannot enter. He had received no positive response. Jabotinsky fared no better with his statement. Wrote Buber to Mahatma Gandhi on February 24, 1939, dispersion becomes dismemberment, when Buber asserted that Jewish destiny was indissolubly bound up with Palestine and in gathering. The Mahatma, who had publicly called on Jews one day after Kristallnacht to practice passive resistance, even unto death, did not reply. War across the soil of Europe, a continent by then seething with fear and hatred, threatened the 6 million Jews, using Weizmann's phrase, doomed to be pent up in ways that none could rationally predict. Even when Vincent Sheehan, musing about what Hitler would do with the Jews, concluded in a book in 1939, the day of mass murder, I'm quoting him, may not be so far off as we think. But he limited this rumination to the Jews of Greater Germany, and he added, the democracies, if that day came, will have their share of the responsibility before the conscience of mankind, which must someday break through the clouds and assert its dominion, at least in retrospect, over the conduct of nations and prime ministers. The British government would grant a total of 13,700 Palestine certificates for all of 39. And to conclude, that March 1939, carrying a suitcase stuffed with Franz Kafka's papers, Max Brod set out for Palestine on the last train to leave Prague, 5 minutes before the Nazis closed the Czech border. That same spring, having been ordered by the Nazis to sell their property and emigrate, the Danzig Jewish community succeeded in sending the sacred contents of its great synagogue museum in 2 large crates, or 10 really, to the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City. Thanks to a signed agreement in December 1938 with the Danzig Senate that they were willing to leave within several months, the remaining 4,000 to 5,000 Jews there were saved from expulsion and death. The funds from the JDC's purchase of these more than 500 ceremonial objects, saving the Jews, because the money went for Jewish emigration. Most Jews of Europe, however, remained trapped by nations which had bolted their doors, while dictators all across the continent, obsessed with anti-Semitic onslaught, would not allow the luxury of orderly, long-range mass resettlement of Jews. The thunder rumbling overhead, as Auden's poem of 1939 made clear, was unmistakable. Implacable evil, resulting in the blackest of tragedies, loomed ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this deep, precise, and extensive conference, Professor Penkower. And if there is any question
or
comments, they are welcome. Please, yes.
Let's make sure this is working. You want to make sure this is
because there is no... Can you hear me now?
No. Oh, he's left.
Yeah, no, he's there. No,
So you will translate
No, he's there.
He's there? Can you hear him?
He can hear you, yes.
One moment. Can I hear here? But I have the zero. That doesn't help me. Oh, he'll help me. One moment. So I can hear your questions and... Yes. Oh, now I can hear.
Now it's okay.
Yeah. Yes, I can. So any questions, including... will be translated. Please, or comments. It can't be the lateness of the hour.
Well, I have a question. Can you
Please.
compare today with those days, or there is no way, no comparison, or can you feel something that looks like, or are we far away?
Do you want to explain?
Hola.
They understand the question?
Yeah, we will, because he's translating.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Señor profesor, gracias por su disertación. Más que una pregunta, es que usted, con su respetado criterio, me responda qué podría desarrollar a partir del siguiente criterio, que está, lo pensé también porque aquí en este mismo cuaderno tengo lo del primer seminario que tuvimos la suerte de tener hace un año, y dice lo siguiente: si los judíos de Israel hubiesen muerto o desaparecido, o no hubieran existido, yo creo que lo habrían creado para así tener un reservorio inacabable en el que se puede dejar impunemente la catarsis del mundo. Esa cultura morbosa es una patología que los sociólogos no han querido o sabido diagnosticar. ¿Por qué entiende usted que será?
Not being a sociologist or a psychologist, but an historian, allow me to answer with a little story, a joke. Because Jewish black humor helped some to get through. It's 1933, and Hitler has just come to power and begun his assaults against Jews. 2 Germans, not Jews, one a trade unionist, left wing, and one a member of the SS, right wing, longtime friends, are arguing about the evils that Germany faces. At one point, the trade unionist says to the SS friend, "I've got it. I know the problem and who's to blame for all of Germany's ills." Well, the SS man perks up. He thinks he's at last converted his friend. He says, "Who?" He says, "The bicycle riders." The other man looks at him in disbelief. "Why the bicycle riders?" Answers the trade unionist, "Why the Jews?" No matter how rationally we approach this subject, that answer cannot be fully answered. We can, as historians, study as I've tried to do in this book. And for those who are interested, I do have some more information. You can get it later from me on the book. But just think about this. An overview of that whole period was never done until now. Why? Everyone focuses on Hitler's Germany. But as was noted in the comments during today's wonderful conference, the Germans could not have carried out the Holocaust alone. They were too few in number. They had collaborator nations all across the continent. And the roots are here, for all the reasons that I explained. It defies logic. There's a 4-volume in English Encyclopedia of the Holocaust. It came out a few years ago from Israel. The chief editor was the late, he passed on a month ago, the wonderful Israel Gutman, who survived the Warsaw Ghetto, who survived Auschwitz, came to become a respected historian at Yad Vashem and the Hebrew University. in the introduction to that first volume, Elie Wiesel, who has deservedly become the voice of the survivors, says, even after reading every word in these 4 volumes, we understand better now how, when, who, what. I still don't know the why. What we have to try and do, since we don't understand, it's totally irrational. We have to understand, and that's one of the major reasons, I could go on this for a long time, but just to get to the point, why many people didn't believe at first the Holocaust when it began. Because it never happened before in history. There's no precedent, A. B, it's totally irrational, as I said. Why the Jews? This was the war aim. It wasn't another aim. As Lucy Dawidowitz and others have shown, when pressed to choose between the war against the Jews and the war against the Allies, Hitler chose the first. Even sacrificing valuable railway trains and men and so forth to kill Jews as soon as he could. The Holocaust went on to the last second and would have continued if Hitler and the others had been alive. So we don't really understand the whys. But we as historians, today, that was one of the questions, can look for warning signs. There were plenty of warning signs. They were all public. The former head of the Iranian government called for the extermination of the Jewish state. Any condemnation at the UN? Etc. There are numerous signs. The Hamas charter to this day calls for the destruction of the Jewish state. And on and on and on and on. So these are warning signs. What can we do? Well, clearly, anyone who is wedded to truth, committed to human decency, has to speak out, organize, challenge with factual information, as we said. Because, and this is at the conclusion of my major book, written 30 years ago, the first overview of how the free world responded during the Holocaust, allow me to quote myself. The cancer of bestiality is the concern of us all. And the preciousness of human life requires daily affirmation. Not Jewish life. As Thompson said in my speech, it's not a Jewish crisis, it's a human crisis. Because all lovers of freedom have to speak out against any racism, against any xenophobia. Live and let live. As long as one doesn't do harm to the other. And we know what happened with Cain and Abel, that very story. The first murder in recorded biblical history. We have to stand up. We have to be counted. It was Wiesel who said, silence is also a statement. You have to speak out for truth and the facts that we try to provide, etc., that such conferences present worldwide, have to do this and press governments, as in Barcelona and elsewhere in Spain, to make any hate crime, not only anti-Semitism, an official act that is punishable by the government. That's it for that. I see there's a question or comment right here.
Profesor Monty, ha sido una conferencia...
I'm not getting Oh, I'm
sí,
with you.
Ha sido una conferencia chapeau, muy buena. Los datos imposibles de asimilar en tan poco rato.
Even though you're not wearing one.
¿Perdón?
Go on.
Perdón. Chapeau en francés. De todas maneras, le voy a hacer como historiador una pregunta. Últimamente, la semana pasada, y usted ha citado a los países de los antiguos países del este, Hungría, Rumanía, y en Hungría un partido político determinado ha erigido un monumento, hablamos de la semana pasada, a un gobernante que deportó, que extraditó a 500.000 de judíos a los campos de exterminio. Es decir, esta Europa, este paradigma, esta Europa que queremos construir de la tolerancia y a la vez de la intolerancia contra los enemigos de la democracia y de la libertad, ¿usted qué opinión tiene al respecto, si es que es conocedor de esta noticia? Gracias.
Not that specific item, but we certainly know of the Dawn Party in Hungary, and we know of other parties in the Ukraine, etc. And that's only the East. But let's not blind our eyes to what's going on in Western Europe as well. There are many warning signs. And as this book demonstrates in the 1930s, when these powers, for different reasons, we have to understand specific historic circumstances, economic dislocation is a great problem, depression, right? But there's also xenophobia, there's indoctrination from various churches, etc. A long tradition, somebody mentioned the year 2,000 years, etc., etc. My response has to be, again, as I said earlier, anyone who has any influence, whether it's the media, the politicians, the historians, the general public, has to speak out and vote, because in a democracy, that's how we express ourselves, okay? Since the Spinoza Foundation has as one of its, if not its main task, to show Judaism as a rational religion, we discussed this last night, let me note that my wife and I spent a glorious day, Monday, in Girona, okay? No Jews. But once in the Middle Ages, there's a wall in the Jewish Museum. It's staggering, the accomplishments of Jews in all these areas, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and on and on and on. So rather than harp merely on the Holocaust, when Jews died, and somebody made this point earlier, we have to focus, first of all, on how Jews lived and how Jews today continue to contribute, despite all these attacks and assaults, however irrational, in making this a better world. Many people use the phrase tikkun olam, to make this a better world. Jew and Gentile can work together, obviously, against the forces of evil. But to do this, you have to stand up proudly and be counted, as I said, whether it's in Hungary or the Ukraine or France or Belgium, etc. I noted to someone that this past year, not only, as David correctly noted, an enormous jump in anti-Semitism in France, assaults, etc., against Jews, the classic late 19th century racist, major classic French classic work by Drummond, okay, La France Juive, was republished. Republished means that there are readers out there in a tough market. You only really publish when there are people eager to read this, etc. In Arab countries, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and Mein Kampf are being read. And let me note, just to finish on this point, I cited this last night. One of the greatest American duo for musicals in the United States, Rodgers and Hammerstein. Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote many plays in the 40s and 50s. One of their hits was South Pacific, early 50s. One of the songs there has a line that I will never forget and always quote. You've got to be taught to hate. Children aren't born with hate in themselves. They're taught. Our job as educators, historians, as all Xavier correctly noted, in different ways, have to teach not how to hate, but how to love, had to respect. The common humanity, we're all God's creatures. Any other comment or question, please? Well, I take off my things. And once again, thank you all for staying so late.